Hello and welcome to tonight's event, an author talk with local author David O. Smith about his book, The Armstrong Brothers, One Pennsylvania Family's Contribution to the Victory in the American Revolution. Before we begin, a quick reminder that David will take audience questions at the end of tonight's talk. Please feel free to send those questions in at any time using the chat box or the Q&A box. Now, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. David O. Smith is a distinguished fellow with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center, a nonpartisan policy research center in Washington, D.C. He retired from the government service in 2012 after serving in a senior position in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Before that, he was senior country director for Pakistan in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense Policy in the Department of Defense. During 31 years of service in the U.S. Army, he served in a wide variety of field artillery assignments and spent 22 years dealing with politico-military issues in the Near East and South Asia. In addition to several scholarly articles and book chapters about Pakistan and South Asia, he's the author of The Quetta Experience, a study of attitudes and values within the Pakistan Army, published by the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2018, and The Wellington Experience, a study of attitudes and values within the Indian Army, published by the Stimson Center in 2020. Please join me in welcoming David O. Smith.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you can see from the background, I live in the Mount Vernon area of Alexandria, Virginia, on land that was once part of the river farm of Washington's Mount Vernon estate. And I'm pleased to be with you to talk about my book, The Armstrong Brothers. So let me tell you a bit about the book. I'll start by saying that in December of 1783, in one of his last acts as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, George Washington sent a list of 16 officers to Congress, which was then meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. He had long been urging that body to raise a small peacetime military establishment for the newly independent nation because of all of the lands that had been given under the Treaty of Paris. All the way out to the Mississippi River. And he realized that we needed a military to protect settlement in that area. And he wished before resigning his commission to recommend to Congress who should be able to serve in such a military establishment. And this is what he wrote. I quote, "In addition to the testimony which accompanies them, I can only add mine, that most of the gentlemen whose names are on the list are personally known to me as some of the best officers who were in the Army. Included in that list of 16 names were James and John Armstrong of Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. Who were they? And what had they done to merit the approbation of a man like Washington? Both had joined the Continental Army in 1776 and had served until the very end of the war in 1783. Their younger brother, Hamilton, had remained behind on the farm in Pennsylvania to work at the farm and protect the family. But later, he established his own credentials as an Indian fighter on the Pennsylvania frontier, which was a wartime experience that at times was even more arduous and difficult than those experienced by his two older brothers. All three of these men were the undistinguished sons of a yeoman farmer who was scraping out a meager living on the Pennsylvania frontier. All three ended up becoming soldiers of the Revolution and officers and gentlemen in the first United States Army that was organized afterward. My book is their story. Can we go to slide 1, please? There you go. I don't know if any of you have been privileged to visit the new National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir. But if you were to go there and ask any of the docents that you encounter what the museum's mission is, they would probably answer that it is to tell the story of the Army one soldier at a time. Similarly, my book is really not a comprehensive history of the American Revolution. It is simply intended to tell the story of three brothers who answered the call to arms in 1776 and to describe what they saw and did during their service in the Continental Army and the militia units that were defending the Pennsylvania frontier. Next slide, please. Well, first of all, it all began with the portrait that you were just seeing of an elderly man in a frock coat with an ostentatious military decoration. And this is the only likeness of any of the Armstrong brothers. The medal was the insignia of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was a veterans group formed after the Revolution of officers who had served at least 3 years in the Continental Army. You would note in that picture, in fact, Brack, let's go back one more slide. Let's show the picture again. You will note that there's a prominent nose of that gentleman. And in the family into which I married into, this was always known as the Armstrong Nose. And certain members of the family had it, and certain members of the family did not. Unfortunately, my wife did not. So anyway, Armstrong was an officer of the 1st Regiment of the Army that was raised after the Revolution, and this occurred in 1784. He fought Indians and was almost killed in a major battle in the Northwest Territory. He was later selected by Secretary of War Henry Knox to undertake a covert exploration of the Missouri River, which predated Lewis and Clark, and that was territory that was then under Spanish control. After leaving the Army, he became a prominent figure in Ohio and Indiana. He was a merchant, he was a land speculator, he was a member of the state militias, and there's a monument that was erected to his memory in Clark County, Indiana, and stands there today. When my wife retired from speech therapy, she decided as a retirement project to write a biography of John Armstrong. Now, much was known about his life after the Revolution. He left a series of papers to the Indiana State Historical Society. And there are lots about his life as a merchant, as a land speculator, as a militia officer. There are many documents relating to his service in the Army and that 1st Regiment of the Army. But nothing much was known about his life in the Revolution. There were very few documents in the papers that survived. So knowing that my affinity for military history after 31 years in the US Army, my wife asked me if I would write the chapter on what he had done in the Revolution. So finding out what he did in the Revolution was actually fairly easy because the Pennsylvania Society of the Cincinnati has a website that gave all of the campaigns to which he was involved. But he left no personal letters, no diaries, no journals. So I decided that if I were going to write about him, I would have to follow his military career through the history of the regiments in which he had served, in the battles in which he had fought, and in the letters, diaries, and journals of other young officers in the Pennsylvania line that he served alongside and fought alongside with. So now let's go to the next slide. And it was very early on in my research that I discovered that he actually had 2 other brothers who fought in the Revolution. Now, no one in my wife's family knew very much about these gentlemen because they were not in the line of descent. And I discovered, after I'd done some research about what they had done, that their combined revolutionary experience basically covered the totality of the Revolution. Not every major battle, as you can see, the battles are on the slide and you can look at many of the famous ones are there, but some are not. They did not fight at Saratoga, for example. But I decided that this was a story that needed to be told about how one family with 3 brothers had contributed to winning American independence and the Revolution. Next slide. My book has 14 chapters. I'll let you just take a few seconds to look at some of them, but you will see that it does cover most of the Revolution. Since many of our listeners tonight are from Virginia, I would point out that chapter 12 is about the Virginia campaign of 1781. And I'm not talking about Yorktown. Everybody knows about Yorktown, but fewer people know that the Virginia campaign in 1781 actually began in January of that year, when the state was invaded by the newest Major General of the British Army, a man named Benedict Arnold, who had lately received a commission in the British Army after having tried to sell out the American position at West Point on the Hudson River. He sent troops up the James River. He burned all the public buildings in Richmond, Virginia. He later, with other troops, tried to seize the Virginia Congress, which was meeting in Charlottesville, and came within about 5 minutes of capturing Governor Thomas Jefferson, who had ridden away just 5 minutes before Banastre Tarleton's group of cavalrymen showed up at Monticello. So there's a lot about the Virginia campaign that I think you might find interesting that you did not know. And of course, it does end with the siege and the victory at Yorktown in October of 1781. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the careers of each of the three Armstrong brothers and give you one vignette that kind of illustrates the characterization of their service that met such merit in the face of George Washington. And afterward, I'll then be able to take on any questions you might have about the book, about the Revolution, or any element thereof. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with James Armstrong. He was the oldest brother. In January of 1776, he enlists as a private in the 2nd Pennsylvania Battalion that was formed in Philadelphia. And this was under the command of a colonel named Arthur St. Clair, who later becomes a major general and later becomes the governor of the Northwest Territory. He's creating this battalion out of raw recruits. And almost immediately, within a month, he fixes on James Armstrong as a young soldier of particular potential, and he promotes him to the position of battalion quartermaster. This is not a commissioned officer position, but it's probably analogous today to what we would call in the U.S. Army a warrant officer, a man who is treated as an officer but does not have command responsibilities. But he was responsible as the battalion quartermaster for equipping, clothing, feeding, repairing the goods of the various soldiers in the battalion, and helping him out along the way on the invasion to Canada. And that's where they were bound. They were going to reinforce the American invasion of Canada that had begun the year before. Along the way, St. Clair decides that James Armstrong is worthy of a commission and makes him an ensign, the lowest commissioned rank, and later on in the campaign promotes him to 2nd lieutenant. So he gets 3 promotions within the first 6 months of his service. So I think that gives you a flair for what Armstrong brought to the fight. I'll let you just quickly look at some of the other aspects of his service. After a year in Canada, the 2nd Pennsylvania Battalion is mustered out, and it becomes immediately raised as the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment. And almost all the men and all of the officers sign on for a period of 3 years. And they participate in the campaigns in New Jersey and a number of battles there, Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth, and then they go through Valley Forge. In 1799, James Armstrong joins the Legion that was commanded by Light Horse Harry Lee. People in Alexandria will realize that he was the father of Robert E. Lee, and he had a home in Alexandria, Virginia. But in 1779, he was a young cavalry officer, and he raised a troop of cavalry and infantry in something called the Legion. And James Armstrong ends up being one of the 3 cavalry troop commanders of Lee's Legion. In 1781, they go south and engage in a number of campaigns. James Armstrong is captured by the British in December of 1781 and exchanged a few months later. And he serves until the Legion was disbanded in 1783. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is one engagement of James Armstrong during the Southern campaign in 1781. And you will take a look at this slide and you will see on the right a quotation from Thomas Babington Macaulay, and I will explain what that means later on. Light Horse Harry Lee is the leftmost of the people that you see on the screen, and Thomas Sumter is the person that you see on the right. Because in the Quinby Bridge battle, and if you look at the map to the left, Quinby Bridge is located just north of Charleston in present-day Berkeley County. And if you look on the lower right of that map, you will see that it occurs on 17 July, 1783, and there's a map pointing to where it is. So what has happened at Quinby Bridge is that by this time, Lord Cornwallis has left the Carolinas for Virginia, and the British are consolidating their forces, and everyone is evacuating into Charleston, which they plan to hold. It's a main port in the South. General Nathaniel Greene is assigned Lee's Legion the task of supporting Thomas Sumter's militia. And their main task is to prevent a British lieutenant colonel named Coates, whose 19th Regiment is trying to reach Charleston. Coates has 600 men and 150 mounted loyalist cavalry and a cannon, which is very important in the battle that I'm about to describe. Coates was trying to escape Lee by getting his troops across Quinby Creek, and that's what is named the West Branch on this map. So on 17 July, Lee catches up and annihilates the rear detachment of Coates, about a mile short of Quinby Bridge. And he sends James Armstrong's cavalry troop forward to find the rest of Coates's command. And Armstrong goes forward and he finds that Coates is already across Quinby Creek and that his troops are in the process of dismantling the bridge. It's the only bridge over an impassable creek. And so he sends back a rider to tell Lee what he has found. But either the rider forgot to tell Lee that Coates was across the creek, and he thinks that Armstrong is asking for instructions as to what to do. So he sends back what we would call today a pretty snarky message that's basically saying, tell Captain Armstrong that he knows the standing orders of the date are to attack without regard to any consequences. Well, when Armstrong, who's on the scene, receives this, he immediately senses that this is a rebuke from his commanding officer, and he immediately spurs his horse and the first section of his cavalry troop, and they gallop over the partially dismantled bridge. And when I say the bridge has been partially dismantled, the British have taken all of the planks up, but they haven't thrown them away because they don't know that their rear detachment has been annihilated. And so they're waiting for them to come. And then as soon as they get over, then they'll throw the planks in the bridge and create an impassable gap. But when they see Armstrong charging the bridge with about 12 people, not more than 12, they immediately frantically start throwing the planks into the creek so that he can't jump over. But Armstrong's first section does make the jump and they get across. The second section comes, and by this time there's a gap in the bridge, and most of the horses will not take that gap. So only a couple of more troops get across the bridge to help him. So here we have Armstrong with a dozen cavalry troopers charging a 600-man British regiment that is mounted a cannon that's ready to fire across the bridge. A British officer who was on the scene said, "It was the most daring thing I ever saw." And watching from the other side of the creek, by this time Lee had come up and understood what was going on. He said in his memoirs, he wrote this, in this perplexing condition, the victory gained by the gallantry of one troop of dragoons was wrested from them. With many of his legionnaires dead and wounded, and they were fighting sword by sword. In fact, at one point, Armstrong is fighting Coates, the British commander, sword by sword over the artillery caisson that is positioned to support the cannon firing across the bridge. Anyway, they realize the futility of what they're doing, and they decide that discretion is the better part of valor, and they retreat. Armstrong's charge over the Quinby Bridge was undoubtedly the single bravest act that anyone in the Southern campaign ever witnessed. Had the award existed at the time, and there were no awards for valor in the Continental Army in 1781, Armstrong almost certainly would have been nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor. The 19th century historian William Johnson referred to Armstrong as the American Cochlease. And that goes to the quote, the rather strange quote that I have on the bridge. This refers to Publius Horatius Cochleus, Horatio at the Bridge, in the famous poem by Thomas Babington Macaulay. And he writes about Armstrong in this way: history does not record an instance of more absolute self-devotion than was displayed on this occasion. Lee mentioned in his memoirs, and he was always leery about giving too much credit to his subordinates, incomplete as was the expedition, the zeal and vigor uniformly exhibited reflected credit on all employed. Sumter was on the scene and watched what had happened, and he wrote to General Nathaniel Greene, who was the general in charge of all Continental Army troops in South Carolina, that the charge made by the gallant Captain Armstrong of Colonel Lee's corps, said to be on the rear of the enemy, is somewhat erroneous, whereas it was through their whole line of march. This adroit exploit needs no coloring. Had the whole of the cavalry gone through with its charge, it's most probable they would have captured the enemy. And Greene singled Armstrong out in his general orders and wrote to Lafayette in Virginia, Marquis de Lafayette, and the president of the Continental Congress. And to the Congress, he said, "Nothing can equal the gallantry of this troop. And had the enemy been overtaken in any other position, the cavalry in all probability would have captured the entire regiment." So that's James Armstrong in a nutshell. Next, please. So now we come to John Armstrong. John Armstrong is the middle brother. Like his brother James, he enlists as a private this time in the 12th Pennsylvania Regiment. This is in October of 1776. But like James, his potential is seen right at the beginning, and he's promoted immediately to sergeant and later on to ensign. And he fights in the Battle of Second Princeton, and then Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. And he has some detached service as a dragoon with Allan Mclean, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. But you can see that he also, in 1778, when his regiment was disbanded because it had gotten so small, it was amalgamated with the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment. And in one of those incredible situations that occurs only in the United States Army, you find the two brothers have now been brought together, serving side by side in the same Pennsylvania regiment. 1781, following the mutiny of the Pennsylvania line, which is described in detail in the book, He serves under General Mad Anthony Wayne in the Virginia campaign that I alluded to earlier. He fights in the Battle of Green Springs and plays a distinguished role in the siege at Yorktown. And after Yorktown, all of the Pennsylvania soldiers are sent to South Carolina to bolster General Nathaniel Greene. And in 1783, he's promoted captain by brevet when he returns to quartermaster duties at Carlisle and Reading, Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. What I want to discuss with you about him that gives a clue to his character is his service with Allan Mclean. In April of 1778, John Armstrong was at Valley Forge, along with his brother James, who was there as well, learning how to drill troops at the hand of some obscure general from Germany whose name was von Steuben. But at that point in April, he was chosen to become an augmentee to Allan Mclean's troop of dragoons. Now, Allan Mclean is mostly forgotten today. But in 1778 at Valley Forge, he served as General Washington's de facto intelligence officer, and he commanded a force of about 100 to 150 mixed infantry and cavalry. And they were meeting daily with informants from British-occupied Philadelphia, and they were constantly in action against British foraging expeditions. A 1783 letter has been found from Mclean that states the following. Lieutenant John Armstrong was introduced to me by the General, the Marquis de Lafayette, and William Maxwell, and highly commended to me as a vigilant officer. We were in service nearly 2 months, and he merits my warmest acknowledgement for his assiduity and bravery. So ask yourself, how did a guy like John Armstrong even come to meet the Marquis de Lafayette, who is a 19-year-old nobleman who had joined Washington's army just before the Battle of Brandywine? Well, he was wounded in that battle, and he was wounded fighting behind a brigade led by another French officer named Thomas Conway, in which both James and John Armstrong were fighting. And either he was impressed by John's performance in that battle, or perhaps John had helped him off the battlefield after he was wounded by a musket ball in the leg. So that was probably how they met. He likely met Armstrong even earlier in 1777, when Washington was attaching small Continental Army units to Maxwell, who was the head of the New Jersey militia and was fighting British foraging parties that were operating out of New York City. And anyway, these two letters corroborate a series of anecdotes that's contained in an 1840 biography of John Armstrong that was published in Cincinnati. And in one of the vignettes in that biography, it sounds almost exactly like what is being described in the letters. John once stationed his men outside a stone wall, or inside a stone wall enclosing a cemetery, while he rode forward alone to reconnoiter the camp of a regiment of British cavalry. When he was sighted, they gave chase, and he deliberately slowed his horse so that they would draw closer to him. And then as they neared the graveyard, Armstrong spurs his horse onward, creating some distance between him and the British, and rides into the back gate of the cemetery while his waiting men open fire on a British regiment and scatter them, inflicting many casualties. In another engagement, Armstrong is quoted as saying that he was only badly frightened one time during the entire war. And that was while he and his men were grazing their horses in a meadow. A group of British cavalrymen came upon them from a hidden road through the woods leading into the meadow. And they were unable to get to their horses to get away. So all they could do was stand and fight. So Armstrong quickly forms the men into two lines and tells them to wait until the British are within 20 steps and to fire by platoons at them. That means one platoon of his company will fire, 10 seconds later, another will fire. It takes about 20 seconds to load a musket. So every 10 seconds, there can be a volley. So the first volley disrupts the enemy's advance and causes them to halt, and the second volley scatters them entirely. So, this is the kind of guy that John Armstrong was. He participates in a couple of other important engagements that Mclean is involved with. One is at the Battle of Barren Hill, and you see the map on the slide there. Washington was anxious to see if his troops had been properly trained by Van Steuben, so he sends Lafayette out with about a third of the available men at Valley Forge in May of 1778. And the British, who also have good intelligence, understand what's about to happen. And so 5,000 British troops go out in two different columns and try to capture Lafayette. Allan Mclean's men are providing a screen for Lafayette, and they capture a British soldier who tells them what's afoot, and he barely rides back in time to tell Lafayette what's going on, and they barely manage to get the troops across the Schuylkill River, which runs south from this point that you see on the map to Philadelphia, and they get across safely without any hazards. And the second thing that he does is when General Howe, who has been leading the British forces in America for a couple of years, is about to leave and return to England, there's an elaborate ball that's put on by the Loyalist Society in Pennsylvania at an elaborate mansion just south of the city. Mclean understands what's going on, and he's not going to disrupt the ball, but what he wants to do is to send a message. And so what he does is he divides his forces into 4 separate patrols, each one with the mission of setting fire to a portion of the wooden fortifications around the city. And when that happens, at a given signal, a large number of these fortifications were set on fire, and this sets off drums, cannons for all the British forces, and sends a message to the British in Philadelphia that your time is almost at an end. And when the British evacuate Philadelphia in June of 1778, the first troops to ride into the newly liberated city were the troops riding with Allan Mclean, with John Armstrong among them. Next, please. The third brother is harder to get a grip on because there's less in the historical record about him. As you can see, he was the younger son. He was 18 years old in 1776. He remains in Northumberland County to work the farm and perform routine militia duties. But in 1778, a massacre at the Wyoming Valley triggers what is called the Great Runaway. And this involves British-led Indian assaults from Canada all along the western frontier of New York and Pennsylvania. And so for the next 5 years, Hamilton Armstrong is serving either in militia units in Northumberland County or in ranger companies. And he has not just one period of duty in a ranger company, he has 3 others, 4 tours of duties as a ranger. And if you go to the next slide, I'll describe what that means. So ranger duty was pretty arduous. First of all, if you take a look at the map and you look at the center of Pennsylvania, you will see the Susquehanna River flowing north, and then one branch goes west and one branch goes north. If you look and see the Shamokin, that is actually the town of Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Wyoming is about 30 miles to the north and east. And that's where the Wyoming massacre occurred. So what did Rangers do? Ranger operations began in the 17th century when the first colonists realized that they could not simultaneously cultivate their fields and protect themselves from hostile Indian attacks. So they developed a system of hiring local men to patrol, or as they referred to it, to range, over a fixed amount of territory that would provide early warning of Indian attacks. And these ranger operations come to full fruition in the French and Indian War, which occurs from 1756 to 1763. Rangers lived off the land. They dressed like the Indians. They had only the ammunition they could carry. They built temporary structures from forest materials every night. Their clothing was designed to blend in to the countryside, and you can see a picture of a typical ranger there on the left side of the screen. They did not wear the tri-cornered hat. They used close-fitting caps, or sometimes simply handkerchiefs tied over their heads. They wore moccasins instead of shoes because they were better fitted to operating in the countryside. They carried muskets, not rifles, as is popularly known, because muskets can be reloaded quickly on the run, whereas rifles require much longer time to load. They preferred to use powder and bullets instead of paper cartridges, which is what most of the Continental Army soldiers used, because they could survive better in a wet, swampy environment, which is what they were moving through mostly in Indian country. Ranger duty required more than woodcraft. It required more than physical endurance. It required judgment. It required discipline. If a ranger unit was discovered and it chose to stand and fight, there was no help expected from any source. So it was always better to retreat and fight again than to stand and die. And that's what rangers did. The best known ranger of the Revolution was a man named Sam Brady, and his picture is on the slide. And so I'll describe a couple of his exploits, and that will give you the flavor of what Hamilton Armstrong was doing for 5 years during the Revolution. Brady was ordered in 1778 on the western frontier of Pennsylvania to assemble and command a small group to go out and seek and eliminate an Indian band that had been attacking settlers along the Allegheny River. They dressed as Indians, and Brady, with 7 men and an Indian guide, went out and ambushed a party that outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1 by employing a simple tactic. Waiting until the enemy was very close, the men would then fire a single well-aimed volley and charge, yelling and screaming in their native garb, and the Indians could not decide who was an Indian and who was a settler, and this confused and scattered the survivors. This was so successful that Brady was then ordered to assemble other 8-man teams that would do the same thing. During a patrol between 2 forts on the western frontier, he succeeded in rescuing 2 children taken in a raid by waiting until sunrise to attack an entire Indian village. And he used the technique to give him the advantage of surprise and offset his numbers. Similar success, these kinds of successes swelled the ranks of the Ranger forces as many local men eagerly wanted a way to take the war to the Indian tribes that were constantly assailing them and kidnapping their children and scalping the men. His most famous exploit was undoubtedly what is called the Great Leap over the Cuyahoga River in the summer of 1780. Indians had been raiding in one county of western Pennsylvania. They had murdered several families. They were overtaken at a place known as Brady's Lake, where he posted 2/3 of his men along a trail leading into the camp. At first light, he and the remainder of his men employed the same techniques that he had been using previously. They fired a volley, they ran down the trail with the Indians in hot pursuit, right into an ambush that he had mounted with the rest of his forces. And all would have been great, except that Brady was then captured by an entirely different group of Indians. And he was taken to their village, and he was tied up, and he was going to be tortured at dawn. And he knew that. He would be killed, tortured in the most unimaginable ways possible. So he waited patiently until his hands were untied, and then suddenly he sprung to his feet, knocked over an Indian woman into the fire, and ran into the thick brush. He was familiar with the terrain, and he knew that the nearby Cuyahoga River had one place that was narrow enough for him to jump over. So he flung himself with all of his might into this place in a gap that was estimated to be 25 feet. Now, in the early days of the Olympics, a 25-foot broad jump would have won you an Olympic gold medal. But he made that jump, but he was hit in the leg with a musket ball just as he finished the leap. Bleeding profusely from his wound, he went to the lake, Brady's Lake, and he submerged himself into the icy cold waters while the Indians searched fruitlessly for him. He was breathing through a reed so that they could not find him. I mean, this is the stuff of melodramatic movies of the last century. And then he emerged and made his way back to the fort. So this is what Rangers did on the frontier. So let me conclude with this. You go to the last slide. This is a quote from General Washington, 3 February 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was almost negotiated. And it's worth reading and thinking on. It will not be believed that such a force of Great Britain as employed for 8 years could be baffled by subjugating it by numbers infinitely less, composed of men, oftentimes half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experiencing at times every species of distress which human nature is capable of. So, in closing, and I want you all to understand that we're just within a couple of years of a word that we're all going to have to learn to say, and that is the sesquicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the American Revolution. It's only 3 years away. So I'll close with 3 thoughts about the Revolution. First, until Vietnam, the American Revolution was the longest war in American history, 8.5 years. Second, the Revolution is second only to the Civil War in human cost. 1% of the population in the 13 colonies died. To put this in contemporary perspective, imagine if the war in Afghanistan, which is recently concluded, had cost 3.3 million deaths. That was the toll in colonial America. And finally, I want you to understand that American independence was not achieved by the men who met in frocked coats in Philadelphia in July of 1776. It was made possible only by the efforts of the soldiers and officers who fought the British Army and Navy. It is only because of their fidelity, determination, and fortitude of a very small number of relatively unknown, but yet honorable and courageous men like the Armstrong brothers, that we are fortunate to enjoy a country as free and as prosperous as the United States of America. So my hope is that you and future generations of Americans will learn to more fully appreciate what a near-run thing the Revolution really was, and to understand how many times the final outcome was hanging in the balance, and to remember how few there were that saw it out to the very end. And among those were the 3 Armstrong brothers. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, David. We do have some comments that were made in the chat, and I'm going to look at these and see what we can. There was a comment as were they tapped to join the Society of the Cincinnati? I take it this is the Armstrong brothers. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, first of all, in order to be eligible for membership in the Society of the Cincinnati, you had to have served for a minimum of 3 years as an officer in the Continental Army. I think you need to look at the Cincinnati in the same way that you look at the American Legion after World War I or the VFW after World War II. This was an association of veterans who had served together for a long period of time under difficult circumstances. They hated to leave the brotherhood that they had experienced for many, many years behind. And so they wanted to associate themselves with an organization that would perpetuate that. George Washington gave his full permission to the Society of the Cincinnati, although it was controversial at the time because it was hereditary. And to people like Benjamin Franklin and the Adams brothers in Massachusetts, they all thought that, well, we're trying to get a hereditary aristocracy here in America, and they wanted nothing to do with it. But that was really not the intent. But I think that hopefully that answers the question.
I have a comment here from Mary Myers, who said that Brady's leap is what they learned about in Ohio State history in the 4th grade.
Well, actually, I know Mary, and thank you very much for that comment. And I'm stunned that you learned about that. When I talk to people about the American Revolution, the thing that I like to start with is by asking them, so what was it that you were taught, in school about the American Revolution? I know what I was taught. I was brought up in Kansas City, Missouri, or in nearby Kansas City, Missouri. And we learned about the Minutemen, and we learned about 1 if by sea and 2 if by land. We learned about dumping tea into Boston Harbor, and that was pretty much it. And then if later on in high school and in college, when I took an American history test, we learned a little bit about, something that happened at Valley Forge and about this German guy named von Steuben that came and trained the troops. And then we immediately cut to Yorktown, and it seems like victory was inevitable. And it wasn't. So we really do not have an understanding, or at least I did not gain an understanding of how difficult the revolution was, how hard it was to endure 8.5 agonizing years with very little in the way with the resources. So yeah, I'm glad, Mary, that you learned that, and I'm stunned that you did. Thank you very much for your comment.
Another comment was made: the Newburgh conspiracy was an apparent planned military coup by the Continental Army in 1783 at the end of the American Revolutionary War, whereby the soldiers were unhappy that they had not been paid for some time and that pensions promised remained unfunded. Having said that, did Major John Armstrong instigate the conspiracy by writing a letter that they should take unspecified action against Congress?
So there are a lot of John Armstrongs in Pennsylvania. The Major John Armstrong that is associated with the Newburgh conspiracy is not related in any way to the Armstrong brothers in my book. His father was General John Armstrong, who was a great hero of the French and Indian War. And I mentioned that earlier. And he was a young officer who was very much had his nose out of place, and he was brought up in a family of privilege, very much unlike the 3 Armstrong brothers that I write about, who are brought up, on the edge of the frontier, fighting every day to put enough on the table to eat. So yeah, but this brings up an important point, and this is, I get into this in the book. So in 1781, the Articles of Confederation have finally been accepted by all 13 states. It took nearly 5 years after they were drafted for them to be accepted by all 13 states. And that put in place a government in Philadelphia or wherever the government was meeting with basically 4 offices, 4 executive offices. One was the Secretary for Finance, one was the Secretary of War, Benjamin Lincoln, one was the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Robert Livingston from New York, Secretary for Navy or Marine, that was a guy named Robert Morris, and he was also the Superintendent of Finance. Robert Morris is a very interesting character, and I write about him in the book. He was probably the wealthiest man in the colonies at that time. Picture an amalgamation of Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and the Oracle from Omaha. That was how wealthy he was. He agreed to take over the position of superintendent of finance of the new government only on one condition. And that is, or two conditions. One, he would be able to engage in his commercial activities. He didn't have to put them inside in a blind trust. And second, he would not be responsible for the pay of the troops of the Continental Army. So to all of my fellow veterans out there, I would like to ask you this question. How long would you have been willing to serve in the Army if you had not been paid for your last month, or this month, or next month, or perhaps not until the end of the year, or perhaps the end of the war, and even then, payment would not be guaranteed? This was what was driving the Newburgh conspiracy, because they saw that the war was over. They knew that Congress was not about to grant them all the pay that they were going to want, that they had foregone for several years. And guys like Major John Armstrong decided to take matters into his hands. Fortunately, it was put down by Washington in a very famous anecdote, which I won't go into here, but you probably all have seen it. So yeah, that had nothing to do with my Armstrong brothers, but it was a feeling within the Continental Army. So again, I ask yourself, how long would you be willing to serve under those conditions?
I have another question here. In your studies of the brothers' part in the war, what did you learn about the wider war that you found most interesting?
I'm sorry, give me that again. I didn't quite hear that.
In your studies of the brothers' part in the war, each of their parts in the war, what did you learn about the wider range of the war that was happening around them that you found most interesting?
Well, I provide the context of the war in every chapter. And you can't talk about what the brothers did without understanding what was going on in the wider war. The most interesting facet that I found was the strategic miscalculations that were made by the British side. Now, the British were a continental power. They had a great army. They had the world's greatest navy. But they made some very strategic miscalculations. And one of those miscalculations was thinking that the majority of the American colonists were actually inclined to support the crown, and that all they had to do was to show up and be on the ground, and all of the loyalists, which is what the people supporting the crown were called, would rally to them. This was a forlorn hope. And this was really not the case to begin with. But second of all, the behavior of the British and the Hessian troops, first in New Jersey and then later on in the Southern campaign, was such that it alienated both the patriots and the loyalists, because the British made no distinction between them. They went after everyone. And both sides, the patriots were emboldened to continue the war, and the loyalists did not want to be associated with the British whatsoever, because they knew that there would be retribution both from them and from their patriot neighbors. So, this was a terrible miscalculation. And this is what led to the campaign in 1781. The British had discovered that they could not win in the North. The last major battle in the North occurred at Monmouth Courthouse in 1778. And after that, Washington's army really did not do anything much for 3 years until Yorktown, although there were some raids that I go into. I talk about Stony Point, Paulus Hook, and some other things that got a lot of press at the time. But then they decided that, well, we've been wrong about the North, but in the South, we still believe that the Loyalists will join us. And so that's why they went south. And the same thing happened. It was a disaster in the North. It was a disaster in the South, because they did not understand the ground conditions. I recently wrote a piece that was put on a blog about leadership lessons. And I described the Southern campaign in 1781, and I said, does any of this sound familiar? Does it sound like Vietnam? Does it sound like Afghanistan, where the American forces went in and did not understand the situation on the ground, did not fully appreciate the mood of the people in the country in which they were fighting, and by way of their operations, what we call today collateral damage, that's what the British would have called what they were doing in the revolution, collateral damage, alienated the entire population. So yeah, that was, I get into that in great detail in every chapter. I try to set the strategic concept for what is going on when the brothers are operating.
I have a combination of a couple of questions here. What would you characterize as your best sources? Were they private letters, army records, personal diaries, a mix of all of that? And how long did it take you to put this all together?
Well, you mentioned in my biography that you read that I retired from the government in 2012. And my wife had already retired, and she had as her retirement job, writing a book about John Armstrong, who's her ancestor. Well, I was not involved in that. It's her ancestor, not mine. I didn't want to get involved in that until she asked me to write about his what he did in the Revolutionary War. So I was serving in the intelligence community. And although I'm not a professional historian, I certainly have no claim on being a professional historian. I found that trying to uncover the John Armstrong story was a lot like what I was doing when I was working in the intelligence community, because you're trying to assemble facts from a huge amount of data. You're trying to determine which facts are relevant and which facts are either wrong or really not contributing to the story at all. And you sort of have to sift the wheat from the chaff. So, it was very easy to do what I was doing. It took 9 years, but as I say, I was not doing this full time. I was only doing it as a retirement hobby. But, for us, it was great escapism. We would make trips to the Revolutionary War battlefields, as many as we could find. We went to any number of county historical societies where you have, small projects that are, only exist in one place. And unless you're there and going through the shelves, you can't find them. They're not online. They're not in any library. We bought a lot of stuff on Amazon.com. I can't even tell you how many books we bought that were out of print that, that we could buy for $1, and $4 for shipping to find out. But no, the brothers did not leave letters. They did not leave diaries. They did not leave journals. So I realized right off the bat, as I tried to mention in the early part of my presentation, I couldn't rely on any of that. So what I had to do is I had to make some judgments. And one of the judgments that I made is that there were letters, there were diaries, and there were journals from other young officers in Pennsylvania regiments in which the Armstrong brothers served. And I just made the assumption that what these officers were seeing and what they thought about what they were seeing would be not too dissimilar to what the Armstrong brothers might have thought themselves. Now, there are some, I mentioned that John Armstrong left a lot of letters and papers in the Indiana State Historical Society, but they were more germane to his life after the Revolution. But there were some letters from the Revolution, and I quoted two of them about when I was talking about John Armstrong writing with Allan Mclean. There's a letter from Allan Mclean. There's a letter from another regimental commander in the Pennsylvania line who's, talking about John Armstrong and his exploits. So, there were some things, but not a lot. So what you end up doing is, if you recall Colin Powell, who unfortunately passed away just a couple of weeks ago, and quite frankly is a great hero of mine. I was privileged to meet him in person when I was serving in Pakistan not long after 9/11. He once said, if you wait until you have 100% clarity on every issue, you will never finish anything. He said, you know, you have to make judgments. When you get 60 to 70% of the available information, you have to make judgments. And that's what I've done in the book. I tried to interpret what I think is what the Armstrong brothers were seeing and doing and thinking. And if there is ever a discrepancy in the historical record, or if there's ever a contrary conclusion that might be reached, I try to point these out in the book and say, given these possibilities, this is what I think happened, is the most likely. And that's all I can do. You know, we're never 100% perfect as historians. We will never have 100% of the story.
And finally, question is, what happened to the brothers after the war? Did their standing in the war launch them into a more prominent, positions for the rest of their lives?
Yes and no. Each of the brothers has a story, and the chapter 14 of my book is the epilogue, and it gives the outcome of their lives after the revolution. John Armstrong, as I've already mentioned, becomes a very prominent settler in the Northwest Territory. He does great things. As I say, there's a monument to him in Clark County, Indiana. James Armstrong, for whatever reason, elected to go south because he was a prominent figure in the Southern campaign. And he went south to Georgia, which is what happened with many people who went south with Nathaniel Greene in the Southern campaign. Mad Anthony Wayne, who, the Armstrongs served under, settles in Georgia and gets a plantation. Nathaniel Greene gets a plantation in Georgia. Well, by the way, he's a Quaker, but he has no problem in using enslaved people to work his plantation. So James Armstrong goes south. He apparently settles in Augusta in Georgia, and he becomes a prominent person there, not well known, but he becomes a military figure. He's fighting Indians in the Georgia frontier, and he becomes involved in a federally funded force called the 100 Horse, where he's selected to be a cavalry troop commander of a federal unit that is raised to fight Indians. In 1798, we were almost on the verge of war with France under Napoleon, and the government decides to raise several regiments of infantry to augment the 2 or 3 regiments that we have in the United States Army. And James Armstrong applies for a commission and is accepted as a major in the 5th Regiment of the United States Army. The regiment is never raised. And unfortunately, that's the end of the line for James Armstrong. He simply drops out of the historical picture. I go into this in great detail in my epilogue chapter, but he probably does what many other Scotch-Irish Presbyterians did. They were the vanguard of the revolution, quite frankly, and he went west. So what does west mean? He probably settled in Alabama, Mississippi, maybe even in Louisiana, but the historical record ends with him. Hamilton, the guy who stayed home, who missed out on all the glory of the revolution, ends up following his brother John into the army that is operating in the Northwest Territory. He becomes, he's promoted to captain. All 3 of the brothers end up being captains in the Army of the United States, except for James, who's a major for a brief period of time. But anyway, he fights as a battalion commander under Anthony Wayne, again, Anthony Wayne, who's John Armstrong's godfather, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And unfortunately, he succumbs to alcoholism, and he dies basically strangling on his own vomit. A very sad end to a man who deserved much better. So yeah, they all became prominent. They all served in military capacities after the revolution.
And in the book, you mentioned that the war was partially a religious war. Can you speak to that?
Yes. In fact, I make the point in the 2nd chapter of the book that because we live in such a secular milieu today, you know, when you ask somebody, well, what was the revolution all about? Most people will say, well, it was about taxation without representation and all of that kind of stuff. But this is a 20th century interpretation. In the 19th century, they were much more forthcoming about the religious dimension of the war. It's worth noting that the population of the United States in 1775 was about 2.5 to 2.75 million people. And of that population, 80% were from Reformed religious denominations. And I'm talking about Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, and I'm talking about New England Congregationalists, you know, the Puritans, the Pilgrims. They did not view an established church as something that they could support. And so 80% were against the Anglican Church, which was the only official church allowed in the colonies. I'm a member in Alexandria, Virginia, of the old Presbyterian Meeting House. So why do they call it that? They call it that because they couldn't, when it was founded in 1772, they couldn't call it a church. So it had to be a meeting house. Quakers had the same thing, although they were much more pacifistic. So there was a religious dimension. And more current historians of the Revolution have uncovered this religious dimension. Kevin Phillips, you know, who's a rather conservative historian, has written a book about it, and there are others as well. I go into this in some detail in chapter 2 of the book.
And that's most of the questions, but I have one question mainly. You know, the Revolutionary War has been really, it's just not as you've noted, does not have the same coverage that all the other parts of our American history have. Do you have any books that you would recommend? I know I read several years ago Macaulay's book, 1776, but do you have some books that you would recommend for a better understanding of the American Revolution?
That's probably the toughest question that I've had tonight, because I have an entire bookshelf of books about the Revolutionary War. I like to think that I have looked at the literature in great detail. As I point out, there are something like 1,400 footnotes in my book. There are 30 pages of bibliography. The best books about the Revolution, the books are in 3 categories. There really are 3 categories of books about the Revolution. The first category is books about why the revolution in the first place, getting into the socio-economic dimensions, sometimes the religious. There are books about individual battles of the revolution, many of those, and I've read them all. And then there are books about the historic figures of the revolution. There are very few books about people like the Armstrong brothers, you know, the unknown heroes, the ones who did not get their name in the history books. Very few of those. But if you ask me to name the single most interesting book that I read about the Revolution, I would have to say it's by a soldier from New Jersey, in a New Jersey regiment, and his name was Joseph Plum Martin. And his autobiography, his account of the Revolution from the standpoint of the average infantry soldier, I can't tell you how fascinating I found that book and how illuminating it was to be able for me to understand what it was the Armstrong brothers were doing when they were fighting alongside, and in many cases, they were fighting in the same battles as guys like Joseph Plum Martin. So I would suggest that is a great book. And the second book that I would suggest, the person most quoted in my book, other than the Armstrong brothers, and probably the most quoted of all, is actually George Washington. This is in many ways a book about George Washington and his performance as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And the best single book that I've read about that is by Ron Chernow, who also wrote a great book about Alexander Hamilton. So any book by Ron Chernow, I would recommend without reservation, and certainly the book by Joseph Plum Martin.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your presentation tonight. And if there are no more questions, we'll call an end. Thank you for everyone who has attended and who asked questions. And the library does have the Armstrong Brothers at the Alexandria Library. I believe it's checked out right now, but make sure you place a hold on it. And I think we need to get another copy.
Buy all these you want. Thank you very much, Bragg. I appreciate helping me bring the story of the Armstrong Brothers to the people of Alexandria.
Thank you. And this has been recorded and it will be available on the library's website in the next couple of days. Thank you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.